Welcome back to the Skilled Builders Guild. Thanks again for watching. Today on the Axial SCX10III step-by-step, we're doing build steps D1 through H2. And that starts with the building of links. And if you don't have a servo tool, I highly suggest you Google where to get one, because this will make link building so much easier. It's really quick, really efficient. First thing to mention here is that these are now metal pillow balls or pivot balls, whatever you want to call them. It's really great that Axial includes them, and this new link construction is really great. These are the same design style as what was on the Capra. They have the hole in the middle, so that it's not quite as scale accurate, but that's totally fine. Now on to the we obviously skipped a lot of the link construction because it's super boring to watch. Here we're building the drive shafts. These are wild bore drive shafts, which are fairly common to all Axial trail trucks. I use MIP grease and thread lock just because I had it handy. Don't use a ton of grease. You don't need a lot. It's just sort of like what I'm showing here. I use the end of my hobby blade to smear it around the inside of the pivot, or universal joint, I mean. And that's about it in terms of lubrication. Set pin and then installing the actual plastic portion of the drive shaft. Do use a little bit of thread lock on that screw when you assemble these. And there are two different lengths. The shorter one is for up front, the longer one for the rear. And make sure that you pay attention to the manual. And in fact, there is an update on that because one of the part numbers is listed improperly. So make sure that you pay attention to that. A little bit of thread lock there on the installation of the drive shafts onto the transmission outputs. And there you go. That's the basic drive line right there. Always make sure that impression that's on the link is on the outermost portion, so facing away from the mounts on the chassis. So the line represents which side you want to have on the axle side. Now I'm just installing the mounts for the actual center skid. And here they are being installed on the skid. They are specific to the location, so make sure that you get all of these in the proper location. The manual does have the proper scale lengths. So when you're building your links, you'll know where each one goes based on the manual. I'm using the Reef's Raw 500 high torque, high speed brushless servo. There will be some trimming required on this piece here in order to fit this servo properly. Not all servos will fit because, you know, servos aren't always a standard dimension. Some are taller, some are shorter, some are a little bit wider. This one's a little bit wider, so I did have to do some trimming in order to make sure it fit. Your mileage may vary though. The reason it has to be flush to that mount is the shock mount actually is placed right up against that servo. The metal servo horn for this kit is included. They give you a 25 and a 23 tooth in the box, so that's really fantastic. I'm just pointing out there where the trimming had to be done in order to get it to sit flush. Very minor trim. Hobby knife is all you'll really need to do that, if you even need to do it. When Axial and Horizon designed this chassis, they did design it around a Spectrum servo. So maybe get a Spectrum servo if you don't want to do any trimming. And here are these are the harder plastic shock towers. These will require a little bit of drilling and tapping just to make sure that you're not going to strip any of these pieces, because they are harder plastic. If you're using a power driver, you could strip them. I highly recommend that you use hand tools when installing any screws on these parts to avoid stripping them. I'm tapping them just so it's a bit easier for me. Not necessarily something you need to do, but you know what? I think I'm going to recommend it anyway. Here we are installing the panhard link. One thing to note on my installation here, I'm using the wrong panhard mount. I'm using the shorter one for if you're not going to be using portal axles. There are 2 in the package, so Axial does have the intention of doing a straight axle at some point. We can all agree on that. When you are installing, make sure to use the portal one. It does make the panhard sit further back on closer to the transmission, and that's so you can clear that portal axle. These are the new sliders. They have a nice groove that sort of inserts with that tab there into the actual chassis rail for a much firmer, stronger connection between these 2 parts. You drill through that hole right there, and it actually clamps itself down on the rail. As you can see, these new Axial rails are a much higher clearance design. You're going to get a lot more travel out of your suspension. And here's the rear shock tower being installed. That's a nice cross brace, and you can see that's where your body post would go if you were going to use a body that required them. Again, these are the harder plastic shock towers, so make sure to drill and tap any necessary holes. There you can see the telescoping style chassis. Here's how that telescoping chassis works. When you do this, and if you want to do a longer or shorter wheelbase, you will need to make new shorter or longer rear links. The links are connected to the skid plate, so you'll need to make different links if you're going to be changing the wheelbase, and I presume that Axial will have those as an aftermarket option, and you know what, I bet Vanquish or Incision will do the same thing. And here's installing the rest of the rear chassis braces and the other side shock tower, putting the skid on here as well, or slider, whatever you want to call it. And putting on the front shock tower. Again, I drilled and tapped just to make sure that we don't strip any of those parts. I am using a power driver, but I do recommend hand driving any of those parts. Those are the front body clip or hidden body clip mounts. You'll need those for the JL body. And here we are installing the transmission, on the chassis skid. It sits in there really nicely. You'll notice the motor is a little bit higher than, say, it's definitely higher than the Vanquish VS410 Pro, but it's right on par with the Traxxas TRX4 or the SSD Trail King. 2 screws on the bottom of the skid plate, and I think 5 or 6 in total there. You can see there's still a little bit of chassis flex, but not that much. And here we are installing the front links on the steering axle. Nothing really out of ordinary to report there. Now the third link. Panhard bar, which I might add, I did install improperly in this video, but pay attention to the manual. It goes on it screws in on the rear of the axle, not the front. And a little bit of thread lock on that screw to the steering servo horn. Now I'm installing the shocks. There's a number of setup positions. I went further back on the chassis just to lay it down a little bit further. And double shear for the shock and the links. Nice suspension movement. A lot of travel. And here's the rear links. Those are the top links being installed on the rear axle. installing the drive shaft. And finally, the rear shocks and rear links. F is a lot of steps, I might add. There's a lot of chassis elements done in steps F, and I think it's the longest, most build-heavy section of the build. The upper shock pivot balls are nice, integrating that spacer so it's all one piece. Here we are in step G. We're starting on the battery trays here. You can see the short and the long one there. This is for installing the short one. There are these little tabs here that mount to the actual chassis. So it's all like sort of becomes a one-piece design, and it's very rigid. And the Velcro strap is included. They only give you one though, so if you want to have both battery trays installed, one won't get a Velcro strap. That's the side shorty tray that I put in on the side there, and now I'm installing the longer one over the rear chassis rails because I do want to add as much rigidity as possible. This is the SX1007 micro servo. These are used for both shifting and the dig. They do include that plastic piece right there that is required for making the servo saver work. So if you want to include the servo saver, you kind of either need to get this part or you can get it separately. I've posted the link down below. Or you can just run without a servo saver and use whatever micro servo you choose. Of course, it's best to power up and zero all your servos so you know exactly where the neutral or dead point is, so you don't burn them out on initial startup. The servo saver includes a spring and all these pieces here, so it does a really good job of keeping that servo from burning itself out. And of course, you'll want to insert that servo saver over the tab in the chassis so you get the actual actuation of that 2-speed. And the same for the dig. This is the radio box or receiver box. It's waterproof, does have a seal on it, and installs from the bottom of the skid there. It's not totally necessary to use, especially if you have a waterproof receiver. Most receivers these days seem to be waterproof. I like to go on the side of caution, so I installed mine anyway. And by doing that, I do limit the amount of space on that actual electronic side of the skid, so I did have to install my ESC on the driver's side, but it actually turned out to be a decent thing as the weight distribution definitely helped out. Here's the sticky tape that Axial includes for the inside of the radio box and the ESC. Now on step H, we're installing the inner fenders, and you can see these inner fenders are very easy to install. Just a couple of screws held in to hold them in place. And you can see that the rock light tabs are already included there, and I'm sure that that'll be an aftermarket thing that Axial offers later on. I wonder if it'll be a full light kit. If you have any ideas about how the light kit is going to be made up, I'd love to get your feedback. And now we're installing the scale motor cover that goes over the electric motor and servo. It's a really nice detailed bit of plastic, and just seeing all of that right up front is really great. I spent some time just recently actually painting and detailing that, and I can't wait to see what other people do. I think that there's a lot of potential in this motor cover. make sure that those tabs line up before you install that screw. Just seats everything properly. And once that motor is installed, there's actually a separate motor brace that goes inside, just in between the motor and the chassis, which also helps firm everything up there. And that's it, all installed. And that's going to do it for this episode. We've covered D through H now, and in the last episode we'll be covering most of the body work, and then this truck is done. So thanks for watching. We'll see you again on the next one.